Generations of people have been brought up to believe football isn't a game for us, yet the sport has a long and celebrated history. In 1895, the first women's football match took place, pitting the north of England against the south in a match that drew thousands to the stands, only for this number to later be dwarfed 25 years later, in 1920, by the world's first women's international game, drawing crowds of 25,000. The sport's popularity seemed to be at an all-time high. However, after stating, the game is quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged, the FA banned women playing the sport on official league grounds. For 5 long decades, women in football were ostracised from the sport, leaving them to feel unwelcome in a sport they had a huge part in popularising. Only in 1971 did the FA finally lift the ban, allowing for a potentially bright future within the sport. Yet the weight of the ban still tarnished the game's reputation, whilst also hindering the public's perception of the sport. Today, more than a century after its initial conception, the women's sport has regained popularity amongst football fans in the UK. When aired, the Women's World Cup in 2019 garnered huge viewership when an estimated 1.12 billion people tuned into coverage across the competition, proving not only does the sport's popularity still exist, it's also soaring. Despite its growth in popularity, however, the state of the sport is still in need of the recognition it deserves. Generations of racism, sexism, and overall discrimination have been ingrained into our sport, leaving many with a stubborn contempt and a lack of respect for the women's game.
We didn't even have our own kit when I played. We used to have to borrow the boys' football kits, and they would wash them and give them to us, and we'd have to wash them and give them back because the teachers at school said there was no point getting kits for the girls. And when we came round to the end of the year and we had like school picture day where all the sports teams had their photos, the head of PE said don't bother photographing them because they're not a real team. The boys at school were definitely judgmental about the girls playing. They'd complain about us taking their pitch time, about them using their equipment, about us, taking boots out of the lost property that, someone had left. Even like stupid stuff like that where they were never going to need them. But I think the most prejudiced I felt was definitely from the sports staff at school. They were definitely discouraged it. And also when you go to the pub and you watch the football and you overhear generally old men being like, oh, I would never come and watch, girls, I'd never watch the ladies play, or I'd never watch, the Women's Super League or the Women's Euros or anything like that. When men say that women's football isn't as entertaining, I think it's ridiculous. And I think it's a shame, and I think it's really sad that, because a lot of them probably haven't even actually watched a women's game of football. And I'm not claiming that the standard is as high, potentially isn't, but that's due to lack of funding and lack of people giving it the time of day. I think it's really narrow-minded to assume that women would be worse at something just because they're women.
Every 4 years, and we pretend that it's super serious sporting and all this, women are not as good at soccer as men.
Men are physiologically stronger than women, which is why they are significantly better at the vast majority of sport. It has nothing to do with culture, society, or the patriarchy. Men are naturally better at sports. Deal with it.
Get your out for the lads. Get your out. Lads.
I should be taking this jacket off when we do it for real.
Made some comments which were construed as sexist, and
It was just
banter.
To gain an insight into the experiences of minorities in women's sport, we talked with BBC sports journalist Miriam Walker-Khan.
Being a South Asian woman in the footballing world, I find it quite difficult just because there aren't many of us. It just feels like sometimes quite isolating because there aren't people who look like you, and there aren't people who have the same like lived experiences. And I think a lot of the time, one of the major issues really is that people kind of make you feel like you shouldn't be there, you don't belong there. You have to kind of back yourself and get rid of that imposter syndrome and know that like you do deserve to be there, which I've actually really struggled with just from little comments people make all the time. And I think that's not even just like a media thing, that's like a football thing where people just think like they own football. Like a lot of white men who are probably the same people being racist to fans in stadiums and online just feel like football is their place. In this industry, like a lot of women of colour, especially online, get a lot of like abusive messages. You get told you shouldn't be there, you're only there to tick a box. You get told you don't know about football, you don't know anything, and just like a lot of trolley comments, which I guess is bleak, but we have to kind of get used to that. When you're in an industry that is really white, it's really hard to kind of talk to people about that and say, you know what, I've been through this and I don't feel great and I don't feel like I can work right now. In a previous job before I was at the BBC, it wasn't a microaggression, but I was working in a team where somebody said a racial slur, the P word, and my boss laughed. And when you're in a room full of white people and people are laughing at that, it's super isolating. Like there's not much you can do to feel all right in that situation. So things like that, like really, yeah, it makes you think, okay, imagine if there was a few more people of colour here and maybe someone could call it out on my behalf because I wasn't feeling like I could. So little things like that, I think it is isolating. I think there aren't enough Asian women in sport because there are obviously like cultural reasons and kind of family reasons for a lot of Asian communities. I think people really just forget intersectionality when they talk about Asian people. And also just like representation, I think is a really crucial thing. Like it's always like a chicken and the egg thing. If there are not enough people in sport that are Asian and women, then like how do you inspire the next generation to think, okay, I could do that? I know personally from being an athlete for like 12, 13 years, I was always told things like, oh, you're rapid for like a little skinny Asian girl. And then you think, oh, well, let me go and put on loads of weight. Like, let me change myself to be more like what I should be as a sprinter. So I think there are, stereotypes that coaches have, that other athletes have absorbed about themselves, that governing bodies have, and they just think, oh, Asians aren't. It's the same in football, right? Like Asians are too skinny, they don't have a good diet, they can't play football because of family commitments. Like these are all deeply like rooted stereotypes that if we don't get rid of them, how is a scout going to get rid of them? How is a little kid going to get rid of them?
badwaaves.
The journey of women's football has been long and hard. We have certainly paid our dues. But the future is bright. If recent events have taught us anything, it is that women's football is one of the most inclusive, welcoming spaces in sport today. The foundations to making women's football a more socially embraced sport across the globe are in place. The momentum created by the 2019 World Cup will guide future generations of footballers to freely expressing their passion for sport, regardless of skin colour, beliefs, faith, age or class. Here you are welcome. Women's football is here to stay, because football is, and always was, a girl's game.
Equal